Hi guys! Time flies so fast. We are now in the finals term of our course, Art Appreciation. For finals, our topic will be all about caught in between modern and contemporary art. So when we say art, specifically the history of art, is one of the most difficult tasks to pin down. It is important to note that the periods and movements of art are themselves testaments to the connection of art and culture in everyday life. As it is examined and analyzed in context, it becomes increasingly apparent that art is not detached from, rather, it is embedded in the affairs of the society which it exists. It offers a glimpse as to the beliefs of specific eras and how these beliefs were translated into how people saw themselves in the world and how they chose to come into terms with it, all in flux. This lesson attempts to provide a glimpse of what contemporary art is and how it was understood, defined, and represented not only in the bounds of art world, but also beyond it. The term contemporary seems simple and straightforward enough to define. There is this assumption that it need not to be asked, rather it must already be understood. But with an attempt to do so, one finds it is a lot harder to grasp. The complexity of the interpretation or the complexity of defining the term is attributed to the fact that people have dissenting views on the interpretation of the present. So lahitag mga views o interpretation when we talk about the term present, the term today, or what the now means. These are often ideas that follow the word contemporary. Even more so, it is when it is hinged on the word art, and suddenly it becomes a bit fuzzy. Another source of confusion is the fact that in the colloquial, modern and contemporary are considered synonymous. So in colloquial, kanang modern o contemporary, consider na sila nga same ra na silang meaning, parehas ra na sila. This, however, is not the case when these terms are used in the context of art. When we talk about art, di na ni sila parehas. Therein, they refer to two different, but they are consecutive periods qualified by different approaches to art making and the functions that art served. To better make sense of contemporary art, perhaps it is best to dial back to its predecessor, which is modern art. Modern art saw the digression of artists away from the past conventions and traditions and toward freedom. With the world becoming increasingly complex, kakalisod atong kalibutan, it required an art that could accommodate such range and breadth. So since nagkalisod man ang kalibutan, nag-require sa na siya og art nga magkaanam sad og kalisod. Roughly, between the 1860s to late 1970s, creatives celebrated the novel opportunities in art, from the materials to its manipulation and ways of seeing and thinking about art. The devotion of artists to a strict narrative was often illustrated in the figurative works. However, these artists gave their nod to abstraction. The tenets of this period were not only reflected in its art, but it was also evident in the way people lived and conducted themselves. The social issues that were relevant, fashion, music, and the wide range of images and activities they were engaged in. This period saw the heavy mass production of goods, along with the encouraging environment made possible by industrialization, the new technology, urbanization, and rise of commercially driven culture. There was also a palpable secularization of society, the interest in nature, and primacy of the self and individuality. Artists were committed to developing a language of their own. When you say language of their own, meaning original but representative. What this means is that artists drew the world, but in its own terms. It was no wonder that within this period grew a vast number of different movements. So since ingon adto man na mag-create man sila own, so naay ni exist nga different movements. The period ensued was touted contemporary art. In order to move forward, it is necessary to underscore that this can be better understood after a starting point has been established. Compared to the dense taxonomy of modern art, contemporary art had fewer isms, mga isms under its wing. Perhaps this was also due to the fact that it is still unfolding. Effectively, this period can be traced from 1970s to the present. There is a reason behind this cutoff. The cutoff was hinged of two reasons. First, we have the 1970s saw the emergence of postmodernism. The affix was a clue that whatever followed was segregated from its precursor, meaning to say the affix of postmodernism, the term post, okay? So post meaning before, meaning to say they saw the emergence that whatever followed, okay, was segregated from its past. Dapat dili siya pareha or separate siya sa kuunsay naa before. The second reason is that the 1970s saw the decline of the clearer identified artistic movements. So the artists in the 1970s saw nga more walay klaro ang ilahang identified artistic movements, reaping the benefits and drawbacks of the dramatic changes that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century. The social, political, and cultural context continued to provoke the artist to create. There is a potent source of reference for his work, so that he may continue to question the existing and emergent values of society. This multiplicity of perspectives brought to light a more difficult terrain to map out in terms of clear and distinct movements, because what compelled artists' works were not prevailing medium, technique, or style. Rather, it was the themes and the concerns they addressed. And the conversation was no longer limited to geographic locales, but became increasingly a global conversation. Contemporary art was heavily driven by ideas and theories, and even the blurring of notions of what is and can be considered as art. With the involvement of television, photography, cinema, digital technology, performance, and even the objects of the everyday, it was the idea that was more important than its visual articulation. In other words, in contemporary art, the idea of the artwork is more important than its virtual articulation or its virtual appearance. There were several art movements that were caught in between the succession of modern and contemporary art. These movements laid the groundwork for the transition into contemporaneity. Reeling after the war, one of the early movements was abstract expressionism. This movement took the basic tenets of abstraction and combined it with gestural techniques, mark-making, and a rugged spontaneity in its visual articulation. Two major styles emerged from this. These are the action painting and the color fields. Action painting underscored the process of creation in that it showed the physicality, direction, and most often the spontaneity of the actions that made the drips and strokes possible. On the other hand, color fields emphasized the emotional power of colors, from the vivid demarcations to the more toned-down transitions. These bands of color were similar to the effect of landscapes. I have here a sample image of an action painting. So, action painting is sometimes called as the gestural abstraction. When you say abstract, meaning to say dili bitaw presente dayon ang iyang meaning, more dili mo masabtan dayon in just one look. You have to analyze the artwork. Action painting is a style of painting in which paint is spontaneously dribbled, splashed, or smeared onto the canvas rather than being carefully applied. Meaning, murag pinataka-taka ra siya og butang diha sa canvas. Unlike sa kanang carefully applied nga, klaro ang line, klaro ang direction, and so on and so forth. The resulting work often emphasizes the physical act of painting itself as an essential aspect of the finished work or concern of its artist. As you can see in the image, ma-achieve na siya nga type or style of painting through candle blowing, or we also have this crayon burning and blowing, watercolor blowing, and so on and so forth. Next, we have here a sample image of a color field painting. As you can see in the image, color field painting is an abstract painting in which color is emphasized, and form and surface are correspondingly de-emphasized. Meaning to say, this style of painting emphasizes or focuses on the color, okay? The color of the artwork. Wala gi-focus ani nga style of painting ang forma or shape sa specific object nga present, but the color lang gyud ang iyang gi-focus or gi-emphasized. We also have another art movement, which is the op art or the optical art. In this art movement, creating energy was the center. Much like what was discussed in the lesson on the elements of art, that dimension can be implied even on a two-dimensional surface or plane. Op art relied on creating an illusion to inform the experience of the artwork using color, pattern, and other perspective tricks that artists had on their sleeves. From making it seem like a section was protruding out or receded in the background to creating movement, works under this movement showed a certain kind of dynamism. It inspired several artists in different countries to create their own iteration of op art. I have here an example image of an artwork under this movement. Okay, as you can notice, diba, nag-create siyang illusion. That's why ang iyahang appeal or visual articulation is 3D or three-dimensional. Even though dili siya real space, you can still create an illusion nga mahimo siyang 3D by using color, pattern, and other perspectives. And because of this illusion, okay, nag-create siya og energy. And that is the center of the optical art. The next art movement is the kinetic art. This art movement is the quest for actual movement in the works created. Harnessing the current and direction of the wind, components of the artwork, which was predominantly sculptural, most were mobiles and even motor-driven machines, was an example of how art and technology can be brought together. And this is an example of a kinetic art. As you can observe in the image, this type of art or this style of art is a real space. And since it is the quest for actual movement, pinito say mugana ni sila nga mga type of art or artworks. Another movement was minimalism, which cropped up in the early 1960s in New York and saw artists testing the boundaries of various media. It was seen as an extreme type of abstraction that favored geometric shapes, color fields, and the use of objects and materials that had an industrial sparse. And the artwork in the image is an example of minimalism art movement. From the term itself, minimal meaning small details lang ang naa, but it involves objects and materials that had an industrial sparse. Another assumption was that its subtext was deference to truth, as a thing was presented as itself, without pretensions or embellishments. Meaning to say, ang specific object or material lang gyud ang iyahang gipakita, wala siya nagpretend, walay laing mga cheche-boreche and other exaggerated designs. The other movement is pop art. It first emerged in 1950s but found its footing in 1960s. It drew inspiration sources and even materials from commercial culture, making it one of the most identifiable and relatable movements in art history. Artists became increasingly critical about how and what was being exhibited in art spaces and had no relationship with real life. What could be more real than what you saw, used, ate, watched, heard, and read? Hence, they turned to commodities designed and made for the masses, particularly drawing inspiration and material from ads, packaging, comic, books, mga movies and movie posters, and pop music. In other words, this art movement believes in the idea nga kung magama kag artwork, kinahanglan nga naa siya relationship with real life, meaning gamit siya. The aim of this art movement was also to elevate popular culture as something at par with fine art. A defining feature was the discussions on the hierarchy. We have high culture and low culture. and also fine art and low art. Perhaps one of the most critical statements against pop art was its use of every banal and low objects and subject matters, and also lacking the elevated aura that others believed art required. It was also seen as an absence of criticality in that objects appeared as it is, seemingly no different from how they were used in the daily life. So these type of artworks are very similar or kanang maogyod kung unsa ang naa sa atong mga gamiton for daily life. Wala siya taga-e og mga flower or mga designs. Okay, so I already shared to you 5 sample art movements in contemporary art. So there are other contemporary art movements, but I will be sharing to you those in a document file. So you have to read it carefully and analyze the different art movements. So before I end this discussion, let's wrap it up. Some of the artists and movements discussed are examples of the rich array of works produced and are still being produced today. The 21st century is steeped in promise and excitement. Although some of the movements discussed may have waned or are no longer being practiced, new artists with their own creative imagination and ways of producing art are changing the landscape once again. It would not be surprising if in the future, art students like you will be confronted with even more diverse movements that attempt to come into terms with himself, society, and the world in which he lives. Now, if you have questions and clarifications, don't hesitate to notify me in the established group chat. Thank you so much for listening and hope you have learned something. Bye!